It's a moonless night in France, September 1944. The rumble of tanks echoes across the countryside, their treads grinding against dirt roads, engines roaring in the darkness. German reconnaissance units, hidden in the tree line, count the vehicles rolling past. 30, 40, 50 tanks, maybe more, an entire armored division on the move. They radio back to headquarters with urgent intelligence. The Americans are massing forces near Metz. The German command responds, shifting troops, repositioning artillery, preparing for an assault that never comes. Because those tanks, they weren't real, they were rubber. Inflatable decoys that 4 men could lift with ease, painted with meticulous attention to detail, camouflaged just imperfectly enough to be believable. The thunderous sounds of armored columns, pre-recorded audio played through massive speakers mounted on half-tracks. The radio chatter, German intelligence intercepted, carefully crafted fiction transmitted by operators who had studied real units so thoroughly they could mimic the unique sending style of individual telegraph operators. This was the Ghost Army at work. In the final year of World War II, while millions of soldiers fought with bullets and bombs, 1,100 men waged war with paintbrushes, pneumatic compressors, and phonograph records. They were artists and architects, sound engineers and set designers, radio operators and combat engineers. They carried inflatable tanks instead of heavy armor, wielded creativity instead of conventional weapons, and their battlefield was the German imagination itself. Their mission: to deceive, to misdirect, to convince the Wehrmacht that American forces were somewhere they weren't, doing things they weren't doing, preparing for attacks that would never come. For more than 50 years, their story remained classified. The men who served couldn't tell their families, couldn't share their experiences, couldn't reveal that they'd participated in one of the most audacious military deceptions in history. When they came home from Europe, they simply returned to civilian life, carrying secrets that would remain locked away until 1996. Many took those secrets to their graves, never receiving recognition for saving thousands of American lives through nothing more than theatrical illusion and technical wizardry. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, officially activated on January 20th, 1944. History would come to know them by a different name, the Ghost Army. It's a story of creativity under fire, of innovation born from desperation, of artists who became soldiers and soldiers who became actors. It's about inflatable tanks that fooled aerial reconnaissance, sound effects that convinced hardened German veterans, and radio deception so convincing that enemy intelligence never caught on to the ruse. From the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine, from the hedgerows of France to the forests of Luxembourg, the Ghost Army staged more than 20 major deception operations. They impersonated entire divisions, created phantom armies out of thin air, and drew enemy forces away from real American units, preparing for genuine attacks. They operated dangerously close to the front lines, often within artillery range of German positions, knowing that if their deception was discovered, they had almost nothing to defend themselves with beyond a few machine guns and their own ingenuity. But before we dive into their operations, before we explore the inflatable tanks and sonic deceptions and radio trickery that made the Ghost Army a legend, we need to understand how such an unconventional unit came to exist in the first place. The United States Army in 1943 wasn't exactly known for embracing wild, creative ideas. The military was a conservative institution, built on tradition and established doctrine. So how did a unit composed primarily of artists and designed to wage war through theatrical performance get approved by the brass? The answer lies in the deserts of North Africa, where the British had already proven that deception could be just as effective as firepower. The story of the Ghost Army really begins in Egypt, in the autumn of 1942. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, commanded German and Italian forces in North Africa. The British Eighth Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, was preparing for a decisive confrontation at a place called El Alamein. Montgomery knew he needed every advantage he could get. Rommel was a brilliant tactician, experienced in desert warfare, and his Africa Corps had proven themselves formidable opponents. British planners devised an audacious strategy, Operation Bertram. The goal was to convince Rommel that the British would attack from the south, when in reality, Montgomery planned to strike from the north. More importantly, they wanted to convince the Germans that the attack would come days later than it actually would, giving the British time to concentrate their forces without tipping their hand. To pull this off, the British created an entire phantom army in the south. They built over 2,000 dummy tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. But these weren't crude fakes hastily thrown together. British camouflage experts, many of them recruited from civilian careers in theatre, film, and design, crafted elaborate deceptions. They created fake supply dumps, complete with dummy crates and equipment. They built mock pipelines, suggesting the British were slowly stockpiling resources for an attack weeks away. At night, they would position real tanks in the northern assembly area, then replace them before dawn with dummy vehicles, maintaining the illusion that the north was quiet while the south was where the action was building. The deception was staggeringly successful. When Montgomery launched his attack on October the 23rd, 1942, Rommel was caught completely off guard. German forces were positioned to defend against an attack from the south. Their reserves were in the wrong locations. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The Second Battle of El Alamein became a turning point in the North African campaign, leading to the eventual defeat of Axis forces in the region. American military planners in London watched Operation Bertram with intense interest. Among them were two men who would become the architects of the Ghost Army, Ralph Ingersoll and Colonel Billy Harris. Ingersoll was a fascinating character, a journalist and publisher in civilian life. He'd been managing editor of The New Yorker, publisher of Fortune magazine, and founder of the New York newspaper PM. He was creative, brash, and not particularly concerned with military convention. His colleague Went Eldridge would later describe him in memorable terms. "I've never met anyone who was such a bright guy who was such a goddamn liar. He'd say anything to get what he wanted." Colonel Billy Harris was Ingersoll's opposite in many ways. A West Point graduate, he was grounded, practical, methodical. Where Ingersoll was the wild idea man, Harris was the implementer, the one who figured out how to actually make those wild ideas work. Together, they made an effective team. Ingersoll would later refer to the Ghost Army as "my con artists," and claim that creating the unit was his sole original contribution to the war effort. It was typical Ingersoll humility, which is to say, not very humble at all. Working with British planners, who had executed Operation Bertram, Ingersoll and Harris began developing the concept for an American deception unit. But they wanted to go beyond what the British had done. Operation Bertram had been a static deception built for one specific battle. What if America created a mobile deception unit? A self-contained force that could move from battlefield to battlefield, staging traveling road shows of illusion, impersonating different units for different operations. It was an audacious concept. Such a unit had never existed in US Army history. They would need to combine multiple types of deception, visual, sonic, and radio. They'd need to recruit personnel with very specific skill sets, skills not typically associated with military service. They'd need specialized equipment that didn't yet exist, and they'd need to convince top brass that this theatrical approach to warfare was worth investing in. Remarkably, they succeeded. In late 1943, the Army approved the formation of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The unit would be composed of approximately 1,100 men drawn from various specialties. It would be the first mobile multimedia tactical deception unit in US Army history, and crucially, it would be ready to deploy to Europe in time for the massive operation being planned for the following summer, the invasion of Normandy. But creating a unit on paper was one thing. Actually assembling the right personnel, developing the necessary equipment, and training these men to execute complex battlefield deceptions was something else entirely. The Ghost Army would need artists who could think like soldiers, and soldiers who could think like artists. They'd need sound engineers who could operate under fire, radio operators who could become mimics and actors, combat engineers who could provide security while maintaining the theatrical illusion. The recruitment process was unlike anything the US Army had seen before. In early 1943, vaguely worded notices began appearing on bulletin boards at art schools across the United States. The Army was looking for recruits for a new camouflage unit. Details were scarce. The notices emphasized creative skills: drawing, painting, design, spatial reasoning. They mentioned camouflage, but didn't explain much beyond that. For young art students facing the draft anyway, it seemed like an interesting alternative to standard infantry service. Bernie Bluestein was 19 years old, studying at an art college in Cleveland when he saw one of these notices in March 1943. He wasn't exactly what you'd call a fighter-type person, he'd later admit. The idea of joining a camouflage unit appealed to him. He could serve his country while using his artistic skills. He enlisted, having no idea what he was actually signing up for. If he'd known the dangers involved, the missions he'd undertake, the number of times he'd position inflatable tanks while German artillery shells screamed overhead, he admitted decades later that he probably would have made a different decision. Seymour Nussenbaum, also 19, was studying art at the Pratt Institute in New York when he got drafted. Like many art students, he was eventually assigned to a camouflage unit that became part of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Neither Bluestein nor Nussenbaum could have imagined that 80 years later, they'd be sitting in the United States Capitol, receiving the Congressional Gold Medal for their service in a unit that remained classified for half a century. Bill Blass was already making a name for himself in New York fashion circles by the time he enlisted in 1943. At 18, he'd become the first man to win Mademoiselle's Design for Living award. Fashion was his passion, his future career already taking shape. But this was World War II, and like millions of other young men, Blass joined the army. His creative skills and design expertise made him a perfect candidate for the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, which would become the visual deception arm of the Ghost Army. Ellsworth Kelly requested assignment to the 603rd. He wanted to use his artistic talents in service of his country. Kelly had no idea that his time creating camouflage and designing inflatable tanks would essentially serve as his basic art training. After the war, he'd become one of the leading figures in American minimalist painting. But in 1943, he was just another young artist who found himself painting rubber tanks instead of canvases. These recruiting efforts pulled in a remarkable collection of talent. Arthur Singer, who would later create the illustrations for Birds of North America, a guide to field identification and design, one of the best-selling special issue postage stamp series featuring birds and flowers of the 50 states. Art Kane, who'd become one of the most famous photographers of his generation, known particularly for his iconic Harlem jazz photographs. Arthur Shillstone, who'd built a successful career as a commercial illustrator. Jack Macy, a Brooklyn kid who'd go on to work in design and exhibition planning. But the Ghost Army needed more than just visual artists. They needed sound engineers, radio operators, and combat-trained soldiers to provide security. The sonic deception component required men who understood audio recording and playback technology, who could work with the engineers at Bell Laboratories to develop new recording techniques. The radio deception team needed operators skilled enough to mimic the unique sending style of individual telegraph operators, essentially becoming vocal impressionists working in Morse code. The Army Specialized Training Program provided another pool of recruits. This was a program designed to keep promising students in college while providing them with military training, essentially creating a reserve of educated potential officers. When the program was scaled back in 1904, many ASTP participants were reassigned. Some of them ended up in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, bringing strong academic backgrounds and high aptitude scores. The result was a unit with one of the highest average IQs in the entire US Army, 119. This wasn't just about intelligence, though. It was about creativity, adaptability, and the ability to think unconventionally. These men would need to improvise to come up with creative solutions to problems they'd never encountered before, to essentially invent the doctrine for mobile tactical deception as they went along. Colonel Harry L. Reeder was chosen to command the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Reeder was an experienced Army officer, but he was taking on a unit unlike any other. His men would include combat engineers, trained for infantry tactics, artists who'd never fired a weapon before joining, sound engineers who understood acoustics better than artillery, radio operators who were essentially actors. Somehow, Reeder would need to mold this eclectic group into an effective military unit capable of operating near front lines while executing complex multimedia deceptions. The 23rd was officially activated on January 20th, 1944 at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The unit was organized into 4 main components, each with specific responsibilities in the deception mission. Understanding how these 4 components work together is essential to understanding how the Ghost Army pulled off its remarkable illusions. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops wasn't a single cohesive unit in the traditional military sense. It was more like a repertory theatre company, with different departments handling different aspects of each production. Captain Fred Fox, who would later write the unit's official history, described it perfectly. It was more theatrical than military. It was like a traveling roadshow that went up and down the front lines impersonating the real fighting outfits. That theatrical comparison wasn't just poetic. It was literally how the unit functioned. Each deception operation was essentially a performance with props, sound effects, costuming, and carefully scripted interactions. The 4 components of the Ghost Army each played specific roles in creating the complete illusion. The largest component was the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion with 379 men. This was the visual deception arm, the team responsible for creating the physical props that made each deception believable. But their approach to camouflage was deliberately unconventional. Traditional camouflage aims to hide things, to make them invisible. The 603rd did the opposite. Their job was to create camouflage that looked good, but not too good. They wanted German reconnaissance to see their fake tanks and artillery. They just wanted those fake positions to look like real positions that someone had attempted to camouflage. This was trickier than it sounds. If the camouflage was too obvious, too easy to see through, the Germans would get suspicious. Why would the Americans camouflage something so poorly unless they wanted it to be seen? But if the camouflage was too effective, aerial reconnaissance might miss the positions entirely, defeating the purpose. The artists of the 603rd had to find that sweet spot, creating camouflage that was visible but believable, deliberately leaving out pieces here and there, making it look like a real unit had done their best to hide their position, but hadn't quite succeeded. The 603rd was equipped with the Ghost Army's most famous tools: inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even aircraft. These weren't simple balloons. They were sophisticated pieces of engineering designed by Fred Patton at the US Rubber Company in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Patton had already made a name for himself designing emergency life rafts for fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater. The inflatable tanks he created for the Ghost Army built on similar principles, but had to meet very different requirements. An inflatable M4 Sherman tank was 18 feet 4 inches long, 8 feet 3 inches wide, and 7 feet 9 inches to the top of the turret. It was built on a skeleton of inflatable rubber tubes, covered with rubberized canvas painted to match real Sherman tanks. When deflated and packed, the entire tank could fit in a duffel bag. When inflated, it weighed just 93 pounds. 4 men could easily lift and position it. But from a distance, especially from the air, it looked remarkably realistic. The key to believability was attention to detail. The tanks weren't just inflated and left standing in a field. Bulldozers from the 406th Combat Engineers would create realistic tank tracks leading to each position. Real artillery shells would be scattered around fake guns, creating the natural debris you'd expect to find at an artillery battery. Sometimes they'd hang laundry on clotheslines near bivouac areas, adding human touches that made the fake camps look lived in. Every element had to work together to create a complete, believable picture. The inflatable equipment was manufactured by a consortium of companies, US Rubber, Goodyear, and even the Scranton Lace Curtain Manufacturing Company in Pennsylvania. Production was ramped up in late 1943 and early 1944. The companies hired additional workers to meet demand. Teresa Ricard was 16 years old, still in high school, when she saw a newspaper advertisement from US Rubber in Woonsocket looking for workers. After school, she'd work the 3 to 7 shift, earning 49 cents an hour, helping to assemble what the workers called targets. They'd paint and cement the rubber tubes, fold them in specific ways, create the components that would ship to Europe and become the Ghost Army's visual arsenal. The workers weren't told what they were making. The inflatable tanks were described as training targets for gunnery practice. The actual purpose remained classified. Teresa Ricard and her co-workers were contributing to one of the most innovative deception operations of the war, and they had no idea. While the 603rd created the visual elements, the 3,132nd Signal Service Company handled sonic deception. This was a smaller unit, 168 men, but their capabilities were extraordinary. Working with engineers from Bell Laboratories, they developed a system for recording, mixing, and playing back sounds of military operations with unprecedented fidelity and volume. The process started at Fort Knox, where teams from the 3132nd recorded sounds of actual armored and infantry units. Not just the general noise of tanks and trucks, but specific sounds. A tank starting up, shifting gears, accelerating, braking. The sound of treads on different surfaces, infantry marching, bridge construction, artillery firing, soldiers talking, officers barking orders. Everything was recorded on state-of-the-art wire recorders, the predecessors to tape recorders, which could hold 30 minutes of continuous sound on 2-mile spools of stainless steel wire. But the real innovation wasn't just in recording, it was in mixing. For each deception operation, the sonic team could select different sound elements and combine them to create a specific scenario. Maybe they needed the sound of a tank battalion moving up a hill at night. They'd mix engine sounds with tread sounds, add some gear shifting, throw in some distance muffled voices, or perhaps they needed to simulate construction of a pontoon bridge. They'd combine hammering, sawing, the sound of equipment being moved, officers coordinating the work, all blended together into a convincing audio portrait of military engineering. These mixed sounds were then played back through massive speaker systems mounted on M3A1 half-tracks. The speakers weighed 500 pounds each. They could project sound 15 miles away. The Sonic Company developed what amounted to firing tables for sound, similar to what artillery batteries used. By accounting for wind speed, wind direction, temperature, humidity, and terrain. They could aim their audio at specific locations, ensuring German listeners would hear exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to hear. The sonic half-tracks were modified with stealth in mind. The speakers could be stowed inside the truck bed, making them look like standard half-tracks to casual observation, but they were also rigged with explosives. If it looked like German forces might overrun their position, the crews had orders to pull a lever. They'd then have 15 seconds to get clear before shaped charges detonated, destroying the equipment rather than letting it fall into enemy hands. Operating a sonic half-track meant living with the knowledge that your vehicle was wired to self-destruct, and you might need to trigger that destruction with enemy soldiers closing in. The signal company Special handled radio deception, often called spoof radio. This was perhaps the most technically demanding aspect of the Ghost Army's operations. German intelligence relied heavily on intercepting Allied radio traffic. They had skilled operators who could identify units based on the volume and type of radio transmissions, the specific frequencies used, even the distinctive fist of individual telegraph operators. A telegraph operator's fist was like a fingerprint. The way they sent Morse code, their rhythm, their spacing, the way they held their key, all created a unique pattern. Experienced German signals intelligence could identify not just which unit was transmitting, but which specific operator. If a unit moved and a different operator took over, German intelligence would notice. The radio deception team had to learn to mimic these individual fists. They'd study real units, learn how their operators sent messages, practice until they could replicate that style convincingly. Then, when the real unit moved to a new area, the Ghost Army's radio operators would stay behind, continuing to transmit fake traffic in the style of the unit that had just departed. To German listeners, it would sound like the unit was still there. This required remarkable skill and attention to detail. The fake traffic couldn't just be random messages. It had to match the type and volume of communication you'd expect from the unit being impersonated. If they were portraying an armored division, the radio traffic would include communications you'd expect between tank commanders, logistics officers, artillery observers. The operators had to understand military procedures well enough to create believable traffic, while also maintaining the proper radio discipline and communication patterns. Finally, the 406th Combat Engineers provided physical security and crucial support functions. Unlike the other components of the Ghost Army, the 406th was trained as fighting soldiers. They could handle conventional combat if necessary. Their primary job was to establish defensive perimeters around Ghost Army operations, to make sure the deception teams could work without getting overrun by German patrols or surprise attacks. But the 406th also played important roles in the deceptions themselves. They operated the bulldozers that created fake tank tracks. They dug emplacements for the inflatable artillery. They helped position equipment, construct fake command posts, and create the physical infrastructure that supported each illusion. Under Captain George Rebb's command, they became expert at quickly setting up and tearing down the props of deception, working in darkness, operating as close as a quarter-mile from German positions. These four components, working in concert, could create remarkably convincing illusions. The visual elements provided something to see. The sonic elements provided something to hear. The radio elements created invisible but crucial intelligence that German signals officers would intercept and analyze. And throughout it all, the combat engineers provided the security and physical labor that made the whole operation possible. But having the organization and the equipment was only the beginning. These men needed to learn how to actually execute battlefield deceptions under combat conditions. That meant training, practice, and developing techniques that no one had really tried before. When the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops activated at Camp Forest, Tennessee in January 1944, they faced a unique challenge. There was no manual for what they were trying to do. no established doctrine for mobile tactical deception, no training curriculum for teaching artists to become soldiers or soldiers to become illusionists. They would have to invent their methods as they went along. Colonel Reeder approached this challenge systematically. The different components needed to master their individual specialties, then learn to work together seamlessly. The visual deception teams needed to become proficient with inflatable equipment, learning the fastest ways to set up and tear down fake positions. The sonic teams needed to perfect their recording and playback techniques. The radio operators needed to study real units and practice their impersonations. And everyone needed basic military training, because no matter how creative their mission, they were still soldiers heading into a war zone. The men of the 603rd spent hours learning to work with the inflatable tanks and equipment. It wasn't as simple as just inflating a balloon. Each tank came in two main pieces, the body and the turret. The body was inflated first using gasoline-powered air compressors. It took about 20 minutes to fully inflate. Then, the turret was inflated separately and attached to the body. The whole process needed to be done quickly, in darkness, often while trying to maintain noise discipline so nearby German forces wouldn't hear the compressors running. But inflation was just the start. The tanks then needed to be positioned correctly, angled to match how real tanks would be arrayed in an actual formation. Tank tracks needed to be created using bulldozers. Camouflage netting needed to be draped, but not too carefully. Every detail mattered. Bernie Bluestein and his fellow artists would practice setting up entire fake tank battalions, then tear them down, then do it again, refining their technique, finding ways to work faster and more efficiently. They also had to deal with the quirky nature of the equipment. The inflatables were built with a skeleton of inflatable tubes covered by rubberized canvas. This design meant that a single piece of shrapnel couldn't deflate the entire structure. If one tube was punctured, the others would keep their shape, but it also meant the tanks needed constant monitoring. Slow leaks would cause the barrel of a gun to droop or the turret to sag. During operations, crew members would patrol the fake positions, checking for leaks, making repairs, ensuring everything looked right. There were absurd moments. Corporal Arthur Shilstone was on guard duty one day when two French civilians on bicycles accidentally wandered into a ghost army position. They stopped, staring over Shilstone's shoulder with expressions of complete confusion. What they thought they saw was 4 American soldiers picking up a 40-ton Sherman tank and turning it around like it was a piece of furniture. Shilstone, thinking quickly, offered the only explanation he could come up with. "The Americans are very strong." The Frenchmen pedaled away, probably questioning their sanity. Meanwhile, up at Pine Camp in upstate New York, later renamed Fort Drum, the sonic deception units were undergoing very different training. The Army Experimental Station had been established there specifically to develop and test sonic deception techniques. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Hilton Howell Rayleigh, the station became the center for innovation in audio warfare. Rayleigh was an interesting character himself. Before the war, he'd worked as a journalist, an investigative reporter, and was known as the man who recruited Amelia Earhart to fly across the Atlantic. He brought a creative, experimental approach to the development of sonic deception. Working with engineers from Bell Labs, Rayleigh's team didn't just record sounds. They studied the physics of sound projection, creating essentially acoustic firing tables that would allow operators to predict how far sound would carry under different weather conditions. They built special meteorological trucks to accompany the sonic units into the field. Before each sonic operation, these trucks would measure temperature, humidity, wind speed, and wind direction. The sonic operators would use these measurements, along with topographical data, to calculate how to position their speakers and how to adjust volume to ensure the sound reached specific distances. It was artillery math applied to audio. The recordings themselves were works of art. The crews would record individual sound elements, then spend hours in mixing sessions, combining different sounds to create specific scenarios. They learned that authenticity required imperfection. Real military operations were messy, chaotic. Soldiers talked and joked, officers yelled, equipment made unexpected noises. The sonic recordings needed to capture that authentic chaos, not just sterile recordings of engines and weapons. One particularly clever technique involved recording sounds that German forces would specifically be listening for. They knew German intelligence would be trying to determine what the Americans were doing based on what they could hear, so the sonic teams would create audio that suggested specific preparations. The sound of pontoon boats being constructed meant a river crossing was being prepared. The sound of tanks maneuvering in formation suggested an armored assault. The sound of large-scale digging and construction suggested the Americans were building defensive positions for a long stay. The radio deception teams faced perhaps the most cerebral training challenge. They needed to become actors working in Morse code. Signal officers from real combat units would visit, explaining their communication procedures, showing the radio operators how they structured their transmissions. The Ghost Army operators would practice, then the real operators would critique their performances. Did they send too fast? Too slow? Was their fist recognizable? Did the content of their fake messages make military sense? They also learned to work within the larger deception plan. Radio deception wasn't just about transmitting fake messages, it was about creating a complete electronic picture. If they were impersonating an armored division, they needed to generate the type and volume of traffic an armored division would produce. That meant understanding military organization, knowing how many radio nets a division would operate, what kind of coordination would happen between different elements. The radio operators also had to master the art of creating believable content for their fake transmissions. Real military radio traffic was often mundane: logistics requests, status reports, coordination for relatively routine activities. The fake traffic needed to mirror that reality, while also occasionally including details that would suggest larger operations in planning. Maybe a fake request for bridge building equipment suggesting a river crossing, or coordination between fake artillery observers and fake gun batteries, implying preparation for a barrage. Throughout the spring of 1944, the different components practiced working together. They'd stage mock deceptions, combining inflatable equipment, sonic playback, and radio traffic to create complete illusions. Officers from other units would observe, trying to spot flaws in the deception. The Ghost Army would refine their techniques, develop new tricks, build a repertoire of methods that could be adapted to different situations. By May 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was as ready as they could be. They'd practiced their individual skills, they'd learned to coordinate their efforts, they developed innovative techniques for visual, sonic, and radio deception, but all the training in the world couldn't fully prepare them for what they'd face when they deployed to Europe. Combat has a way of creating situations no one anticipated, problems no training exercise prepared you for. The Ghost Army was about to find out just how unpredictable war could be, and how quickly they'd need to adapt their methods to survive and succeed. The bulk of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops arrived in England in May 1944, just before D-Day. They were based near Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's birthplace. The irony wasn't lost on the men. Here they were, theatrical performers preparing to stage elaborate illusions, headquartered in the hometown of history's greatest playwright. Some of the soldiers spent their brief time in England visiting Shakespeare's house, walking the streets where the bard had walked centuries before, perhaps drawing inspiration for the performances they were about to give on a very different kind of stage. The Ghost Army's first involvement in the European theatre came with Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign preceding D-Day. Fortitude was primarily a British operation, designed to convince German command that the Allied invasion would target Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The deception involved creating an entirely fictional 1st US Army group, FUSAG, supposedly based in southeastern England and preparing to assault Calais. The Ghost Army's role in fortitude was relatively small. Some personnel helped with the creation of fake radio traffic. Visual deception elements contributed to the Phantom Army being constructed in southeastern England, but mostly they were learning, observing how the British approached large-scale strategic deception, understanding how visual elements, radio traffic, and intelligence operations could be coordinated to fool enemy command. The real action for the Ghost Army would come after D-Day, when Allied forces were establishing themselves in France and beginning the difficult fight to break out of Normandy. Small elements of the 23rd arrived in Normandy about 2 weeks after the initial landings. Their first assignment was typically Ghost Army: use lights and visual elements to simulate a Mulberry Harbour at night, drawing German artillery fire away from the real artificial harbours the Allies were constructing. The Mulberry Harbours were crucial to Allied logistics. These were portable harbours, essentially massive floating docks that could be towed across the English Channel and assembled on the Normandy coast. They allowed the Allies to unload supplies directly onto the beaches without needing to capture an intact port. The Germans knew how important these harbours were. They directed artillery fire at them whenever possible. The Ghost Army set up elaborate light displays that suggested harbour construction was happening in locations away from the real Mulberry Harbours. German artillery batteries, seeing what looked like major construction activity, directed their fire at the fake positions. It was the Ghost Army's first real taste of being under fire. The deception worked. German shells fell on empty beaches while the real harbours continued their vital work. But this was just a warm-up. The full Ghost Army hadn't yet deployed to France, and they hadn't yet attempted a major multimedia deception combining all their capabilities. That first major test would come in August 1944 at a place called Brest. Operation Brest would prove to be a crucial learning experience, teaching the Ghost Army important lessons about coordination, communication, and the real dangers of deception work. Brest was a port city on the far western tip of Brittany, the peninsula jutting out into the Atlantic from northwestern France. German forces, under the command of General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, had fortified the city and were determined to hold out. About 30,000 German troops defended Brest, more than Allied intelligence had anticipated. 3 American divisions from the 8th Corps, the 2nd, 8th, and 29th, encircled the port. The strategic importance of Brest had diminished somewhat by August. The Allies had made better progress than expected in establishing supply lines through Normandy, reducing the urgency of capturing Brittany's ports. But both General Omar Bradley and General George Patton felt they couldn't just leave Brest in German hands. As Patton put it in his diary, quoting Bradley, "We must take Brest in order to maintain the illusion of the fact that the US Army cannot be beaten." Patton himself concurred, "Any time we put our hand to a job, we must finish it." The Ghost Army's mission was to impersonate the 6th Armoured Division, which had previously swept through Brittany and was now needed elsewhere. By creating the illusion that the 6th Armoured was still present around Brest, the Ghost Army hoped to convince General Ramke that American forces were stronger than they actually were, possibly encouraging him to surrender. They also wanted to draw German attention to the flanks of the battle, potentially clearing the way for an American attack through the center. This was the first time the 23rd would use all 3 forms of deception together: visual, sonic, and radio. It was also one of the rare times they'd be operating in the middle of an active, intense battle. Corporal Jack Macy from Brooklyn later recalled Brest as the biggest piece of action I ever saw in World War II. The Ghost Army set up 2 notional tank battalions using inflatable tanks. They positioned these fake forces on the flanks of the American lines. Bulldozers created realistic tank tracks. The sonic units were deployed close to German lines, within 500 yards in some cases, and operated for 3 nights running. They blasted the sounds of tanks approaching, harboring, and withdrawing. The recordings were so convincing that real American troops a mile away were certain tanks were assembling near them. The radio deception teams created traffic consistent with the 6th Armored Division's communication patterns. They generated the type and volume of messages German signals intelligence would expect from an armored division. Everything pointed to the continued presence of a major American armored force. The deception had mixed results. After Brest eventually fell on September the 27th, General Ramke mentioned in his debriefing that he'd held out against 3 infantry divisions and 1 armored division. The Ghost Army had successfully convinced him they were the 6th Armored. From that perspective, the operation was a success, but there were also costly failures in coordination. The Ghost Army had set up fake positions to draw German attention to certain areas. Through miscommunication or misunderstanding of where the deception was focused, Company D of the 709th Tank Battalion launched an attack from near where the Ghost Army had been trying to attract German fire. The result was catastrophic. German artillery, already zeroed in on what they thought were American positions, immediately hammered the real tanks. 5 tanks were destroyed before they even reached their line of departure. The tank crews never had a chance. This weighed heavily on the men of the 23rd. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson, the unit's operations officer, wrote an analysis after the battle, emphasizing the crucial importance of careful coordination and communication. The tanks should not have attacked in that place, Simonson noted, or otherwise the 23rd should have employed deception in another area. The Ghost Army also used flash deception at Brest for the first time. Dummy artillery batteries were positioned 600 to 800 yards in front of real American artillery. These fake batteries used special canisters that created bright flashes when ignited, mimicking the muzzle flash of artillery firing. The idea was to draw German counter-battery fire onto the fake positions. It worked. The dummy batteries operated for 3 nights and received about 20 to 25 rounds of enemy fire. The real artillery battalion received none during that period. Operation Brest taught the Ghost Army several crucial lessons. First, coordination with other units was absolutely essential. Deception operations needed to be carefully integrated into overall battle plans, with clear communication about where fake positions were located. Second, sonic deception was remarkably effective. Even experienced American troops couldn't tell the difference between recorded sounds and real tank movements. Third, the work was genuinely dangerous. Operating within artillery range of German positions, trying to attract enemy attention, meant accepting real risk. The men also learned they could handle combat conditions. This wasn't a safe, rear echelon assignment. They were close enough to the enemy to draw fire. They worked under the constant possibility that German patrols might discover their inflatable tanks, their sonic trucks, their entire operation. And they performed well, maintaining their discipline, executing their deceptions even when shells were falling nearby. After Brest, the Ghost Army continued to refine their techniques through several smaller operations. They learned to adapt to different situations, to improvise when plans didn't work out, to coordinate more effectively with the real combat units they were supporting. Each operation added to their collective knowledge, building a repertoire of techniques and approaches. But while the Ghost Army was developing these battlefield skills, questions remained about who exactly these men were. What kind of people volunteer for a unit where success means convincing the enemy to shoot at you? Walk through the Ghost Army's bivouac area on a quiet afternoon in France, and you'd encounter scenes that seemed almost surreal for a combat zone. Men hunched over sketch pads, drawing the French countryside. Watercolors of ruined villages drying on makeshift easels. Soldiers discussing composition and perspective while cleaning their rifles. Someone might be reading Vogue magazine in a foxhole. fashion sketches scattered among military maps. This was the Ghost Army at rest, and it was unlike any other unit in the European theatre. Bill Blass was one of the most unusual soldiers in the entire US Army. Even before the war, he'd begun making a name for himself in New York fashion circles. When he enlisted and found himself assigned to the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, he didn't abandon his passion for design. Quite the opposite. In his rare moments of downtime, Blass would sketch dress designs. He'd send these sketches to fashion houses in Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires, maintaining his connections in the industry even while inflating rubber tanks in combat zones. Bill Sales, an art director who served with Blass in the Ghost Army, remembered his attitude. He would never shirk a duty. If it was cleaning trash cans, he was right there with a smile and beautiful teeth. Blass brought a sense of style to everything he did, even in war. In December 1944, while stationed in Luxembourg, lying on a bunk, Blass sketched what would eventually become his corporate logo. He was planning his post-war career even as the Battle of the Bulge raged nearby. After the war, Blass returned to New York and built a fashion empire. He became one of the most successful American designers of his generation, dressing first ladies and Hollywood stars. But he never forgot his time with the Ghost Army. In 1967, he designed the uniforms for the United States Pavilion Guides at the Montreal World's Fair, offering his design services to his country once again, this time in peacetime. Ellsworth Kelly had a very different personality, but brought equally important creative sensibilities to the Ghost Army. Where Blass was outgoing and social, Kelly was more reserved, more focused on his internal artistic vision. He'd requested assignment to the 603rd specifically because he wanted to use his artistic skills in the war effort. Kelly's duties with the Ghost Army essentially became his basic art training. He designed camouflage patterns, studying how colors and shapes interact, how the eye perceives forms at different distances. He helped create the inflatable tanks and other deception equipment, thinking about scale and proportion. He designed propaganda posters, learning about visual communication and persuasion. All of this fed into his post-war development as an artist. After the war, Kelly became one of the leading figures in American minimalist painting. His work was characterized by bold, simple shapes, often in bright colors. The influence of his camouflage work is visible in many of his paintings. The way he broke down complex forms into essential geometric shapes, his understanding of how colors interact, his appreciation for the power of simplicity. In a very real way, the Ghost Army was Kelly's art school, and the techniques he learned creating battlefield deceptions translated directly into his post-war masterpieces. Throughout their time in Europe, Kelly and his fellow Ghost Army artists were prolific. They used any spare moments to sketch and paint. John Jarvie, a corporal in the 23rd, described it this way: "We were sleeping in hedgerows and foxholes, but nothing kept us away from going someplace to do a watercolor." The resulting artwork provides a remarkable window into their experiences, showing not just what they saw, but how they saw it. Arthur Singer would later become famous for his bird illustrations, creating some of the most recognizable images in American ornithology. But during the war, he sketched French villages, German prisoners, his fellow soldiers. The attention to detail that would later make his bird illustrations so accurate was honed during those years in Europe, learning to capture exactly what he observed. Arthur Shilstone, who later built a successful career as a commercial illustrator, created paintings of Ghost Army operations both during and after the war. His 1985 painting, Americans Are Very Strong, depicted the incident with the French civilians who saw soldiers carrying an inflatable tank. These paintings and sketches weren't just art. They were visual records of operations that were classified for decades. When the Ghost Army story finally became public in 1996, these artworks became crucial historical documents. Art Kane joined the Ghost Army after studying at the Cooper Union in New York. After the war, he became one of the most innovative photographers in America, known particularly for his jazz photography. His iconic image, A Great Day in Harlem, showing 57 jazz musicians gathered on a Harlem stoop in 1958, became one of the most famous photographs in jazz history. The compositional skills Kane developed while creating visual deceptions for the Ghost Army, thinking about how to arrange elements to create specific impressions, clearly influenced his photographic work. But the Ghost Army wasn't composed entirely of future famous artists. Most of the men were ordinary soldiers who happened to have creative skills. They were art students who'd been drafted, commercial artists doing their part in the war, designers and draftsmen contributing their talents. After the war, they'd returned to relatively normal civilian careers. But during their service, they formed a remarkable creative community. The artists would help each other with their work, critique each other's sketches, discuss art and design even while living in combat conditions. They'd trade techniques, share materials when supplies were scarce. Some of them maintained these friendships for decades after the war. Bill Blass, Jack Macy, and Arthur Shilstone stayed in touch, helping each other with projects, attending each other's exhibitions. Robert Tompkins, who served in the 603rd, kept a detailed diary throughout his time with the Ghost Army, despite standing orders not to keep written records of their classified operations. His diary provides invaluable insights into daily life in the unit. He wrote about the operations, yes, but also about the cold, the food, the boredom between missions, the fear when German artillery opened up, the satisfaction of pulling off a successful deception. Tompkins and Blass became particularly close friends. After the war, Tompkins worked with Arthur Shilstone in a New York design studio. The network of Ghost Army artists supported each other, professionally and personally, a bond formed through shared experiences few, others, could understand. The sonic deception and radio operators, while not artists in the traditional sense, brought their own creative skills to the unit. Dick Syracuse was typical of the sonic deception personnel. Before joining the 3132nd, he'd worked in audio recording. The Army sent him to Pine Camp for training in the specialized techniques needed for battlefield sonic deception. He learned to record sounds of military operations, to mix different audio elements, to operate the specialized equipment that could project those sounds across miles of battlefield. Syracuse found the work fascinating. He was essentially doing cutting-edge audio engineering, using techniques that wouldn't become common in commercial recording for years. Multi-track recording, sound mixing, acoustic calculations to predict sound propagation. All of this was innovative in 1944. After the war, some of the sonic deception personnel went into careers in radio, television, and later the recording industry, applying techniques they'd first learned while trying to fool the German army. The radio operators were perhaps the unit's most underappreciated performers. Men like Spike Berry, who served in the Signal Company Special, essentially became method actors. They had to immerse themselves in the units they were impersonating, learning not just how those units communicated, but internalizing their patterns, their rhythms, their personalities. A good spoof radio operator could become another unit's radio operator so completely that German signals intelligence couldn't tell the difference. Berry described their role perfectly. Radio was the stage setter. We were the silent orchestra underneath the musical on the stage. When you think of the 23rd Special Troops, you think of the inflatable tank or the sound guys, and they're great, but they have to have a stage on which to perform. And we provided that stage. We painted a picture for German intelligence in their mind as to what was going on. This creative, theatrical approach to warfare created a unique culture within the Ghost Army. They thought of their operations as performances. They critiqued each other's work like artists reviewing a gallery show. They took pride in the craft of deception, in the quality of their illusions. When an operation went well, when they successfully fooled German intelligence, The satisfaction came from knowing they'd created something convincing, something that stood up to enemy scrutiny. But this also meant they carried a different kind of weight than most combat units. If a regular infantry unit failed in an attack, soldiers got wounded or killed. But at least they'd fought honestly. If the Ghost Army's deception failed, if the Germans saw through their illusion, people would die because of a failed performance. That knowledge added psychological pressure that most soldiers never experienced. Colonel Reeder, commanding this eclectic collection of artists, engineers, and creative specialists, had to manage personalities and egos that weren't typical in the army. These weren't men who responded well to arbitrary authority or mindless discipline. They needed to understand the purpose of what they were doing, to believe in the mission, to feel their creativity was being properly utilized. Reeder, to his credit, seemed to understand this. He gave his men considerable latitude in how they approached problems, encouraged innovation, valued their creative input. The result was a unit that could adapt quickly to changing situations, that could invent new techniques on the fly, that approached each operation as a creative challenge rather than just following established procedures. This flexibility would prove crucial as the Ghost Army faced increasingly complex and dangerous missions. By late summer 1944, the Ghost Army had found its rhythm. After the learning experiences at Brest and several smaller operations, they developed efficient procedures for setting up and tearing down their traveling roadshow of deception. Each operation followed a similar pattern. Receive intelligence about German positions and dispositions, plan the deception to support specific tactical goals, move into position, usually under cover of darkness, set up visual and sonic elements, begin radio operations, maintain the illusion for the required duration, then pack up and move to the next operation. But war never unfolds according to plan, and the Ghost Army would find themselves tested in new ways as the Allied advance pushed deeper into France. Operation Brittany, conducted in early August, demonstrated the Ghost Army's growing sophistication. The mission was to create the impression that American forces were weakening their positions facing German defensive lines, to redirect units into clearing the Brittany Peninsula. If successful, this might prevent German forces from withdrawing and consolidating their positions, keeping them tied down in less strategically important areas. The 23rd split into 4 task forces, each impersonating a different division. The 35th, 80th, and 90th Infantry Divisions, plus the 2nd Armoured Division. Each task force assembled near their respective division's actual location, then turned west or south, while the real divisions continued east. The deception relied primarily on radio traffic and special effects, with limited use of inflatable equipment. The task forces had varying experiences. The Phantom 80th Infantry Column, under Captain Oscar Seal, intended to drive to Brest, but stopped short when German resistance proved stronger than expected. The Phantom 90th Infantry Column, under Lieutenant Colonel Edgar Schroeder, made it nearly to Lorient, covering over 600 miles and receiving occasional sniper fire along the way. The fake 2nd Armoured Combat Command went south into what the soldiers called Indian Country, territory not yet cleared of German forces. They set up some inflatable positions, collected French resistance fighters prisoners for transfer to real Allied units, and generally maintained the fiction of an American armored force operating in the area. The deception was done primarily through special effects and radio. Each column displayed proper unit insignias, wore correct shoulder patches, drove vehicles with authentic-looking unit markings. They carried out their roles so convincingly that they didn't just fool Germans, they confused other American units. There were multiple reports of soldiers from the real divisions encountering the Ghost Army's fake columns and assuming they were the genuine article. In September, the Ghost Army faced one of their most challenging and dangerous assignments. General Patton's Third Army was attacking the heavily fortified French city of Metz. During this attack, a gap opened in Patton's line. A real division was on its way to plug the gap, but it would take time to get into position. Meanwhile, German forces could potentially exploit the opening, creating a serious threat to Patton's flank. The Ghost Army was rushed into the gap. Their mission: impersonate an entire division and hold the line until the real unit arrived. They would need to maintain this deception for about a week, making German forces believe that Patton's flank was secure when in fact it was dangerously exposed. The operation required every trick in the Ghost Army's playbook. They set up inflatable tanks and artillery in defensive positions. The sonic trucks operated continuously, playing sounds of rumbling armor, shouting troops, and even sergeants barking orders for soldiers to put out their cigarettes. The radio operators created traffic consistent with a full division holding a defensive line. Special effects teams drove trucks around nearby roads to create dust and movement that would be visible to German observers. Patton himself was feeling the pressure. In a letter to his wife, he mentioned the situation without revealing the Ghost Army's role. "There is one rather bad spot in my line, but I don't think the Huns know it. By tomorrow night, I will have it plugged." What Patton didn't mention was that the plug was currently made of rubber tanks and sound effects. The deception held for 7 days. German forces, convinced they faced a strong defensive position, didn't probe the gap aggressively. When the real division finally arrived and took over, the Ghost Army quietly packed up and moved on. Years later, Rick Beyer, the filmmaker and historian who documented the Ghost Army story, would note that Patton was extremely helpful and welcoming to the Ghost Army, making suggestions to improve their deceptions. Patton understood the value of what they were doing. As fall turned to winter, the Ghost Army continued their operations across France and into Luxembourg. They impersonated divisions, created phantom headquarters, staged fake Kist, movements of armor and artillery. Each operation added to their experience, refined their techniques. They learned which approaches worked best in different terrain, how to adapt their deceptions based on German capabilities and positions, when to emphasize visual elements versus sonic versus radio. In December 1944, the Germans launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, the operation that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. This massive assault caught Allied forces off guard, creating chaos and desperate fighting across a broad front. The Ghost Army played a supporting role, using radio deception to confuse German intelligence about Allied unit positions and movements. Operation Kodak, a radio deception run in support of the relief of Bastogne, exemplified their contribution. While the real American forces maneuvered to break the German encirclement of the crucial Belgian town, the Ghost Army's radio operators created fake traffic suggesting Allied forces were concentrated in different locations. It wasn't the Ghost Army's most elaborate deception, but it contributed to the confusion that hampered German command during the critical period of the battle. Throughout this period, the men of the 23rd were also living the daily reality of soldiers at war. They dealt with cold, hunger, exhaustion. They lived in foxholes and slept in hedgerows. They endured artillery barrages and air raids. Between operations, they pulled regular guard duty, maintained their equipment, dealt with military bureaucracy. But they also found moments of beauty and humanity. They sketched the French countryside, befriended local civilians, attended church services in medieval cathedrals. They traded cigarettes for fresh eggs with French farmers. They drank wine in liberated villages, danced with local girls at impromptu celebrations. War has a way of compressing experiences, making quiet moments precious and memorable. The Ghost Army crossed into Luxembourg in September 1944, just days after the country's liberation. Crowds lined the streets of Esch-sur-Alzette, cheering the American convoy, having no idea what was hidden in those canvas-covered trucks. The Ghost Army would eventually establish a base in Luxembourg, operating from there for several months. The country became special to many of the men. Years later, when historical markers were placed to commemorate Ghost Army operations, one of the first was in Bettemburg, Luxembourg, recognizing the unit's connection to the small nation. As winter gave way to early spring 1945, the war was entering its final phase. Allied forces had recovered from the Bulge and were pushing toward the Rhine River, Germany's last major natural defensive barrier. Crossing the Rhine would open the path into Germany's industrial heartland, bringing the Allies to the doorstep of final victory. For the Ghost Army, this meant one last major operation, one final performance, one opportunity to put everything they'd learned into creating the most elaborate, most comprehensive, most effective deception of their entire service. By March 1945, the war's end was clearly approaching. Allied armies had pushed German forces back to the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The 9th Army, commanded by General William Simpson, was preparing for a critical Rhine crossing. The operation would be codenamed Plunder, and its success was crucial to the final push into Germany. But river crossings are among the most difficult military operations. Troops are vulnerable while crossing. Engineering equipment is exposed. The entire operation requires careful coordination. The Germans knew the Allies would attempt a Rhine crossing somewhere. They'd fortified likely crossing points, positioned artillery to cover approaches to the river, prepared defensive positions on the far bank. The Allied command needed every advantage they could get. That's where the Ghost Army came in. Lieutenant Colonel Merrick Truly, the 23rd's liaison officer attached to the 9th Army's planning section, helped conceive Operation Vincennes. The objective, as stated in the official after-action report, was, as part of a 9th US Army deception plan, to deceive the enemy as to the actual Rhine River crossing area, strength of the crossing and time of crossing. The specific mission was to simulate the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions in assembly areas in the 13th Corps Zone, while the actual divisions were assembling in the 16th Corps Zone 10 miles north. The Ghost Army would create the illusion of a major crossing preparation in the wrong location, drawing German attention and resources away from the actual crossing point. This would be the 23rd's most ambitious operation. They would need to impersonate 2 full divisions, approximately 40,000 men. They'd need to make it look like these divisions were preparing for an assault river crossing with all the equipment and activity that implied, and they'd need to maintain the deception long enough for the real crossing to succeed. Operation Vincennes began on March 18th. The Ghost Army moved into position east and west of the German city of Vincennes in the 13th Corps Zone. What followed was a week-long performance that used every capability the unit possessed. The visual deception was staggering in scale. The 603rd set up more than 600 inflatable vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, even reconnaissance aircraft. They created entire fake tank battalions, artillery batteries, supply depots, and command posts. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken during the operation showed remarkably authentic-looking military installations. The inflatables were positioned in proper tactical formations, with realistic spacing and defensive arrangements. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Bulldozers created tank tracks leading to each position. Camouflage netting was draped over equipment, but deliberately imperfect, so aerial observers could see through it. Real ammunition and supplies were scattered around positions to add authenticity. Fake guards were posted at command post entrances. Everything was designed to create a complete, believable picture of 2 divisions preparing for combat. The Ghost Army even created fake airfields with inflatable L-5 observation planes. These were so realistic that an actual L-5 pilot, not informed about the deception, landed on one of the fake airfields by mistake. The Ghost Army personnel rushed over and, in violation of every security protocol they'd learned, forcefully told the confused pilot to get the hell out immediately. They couldn't risk him discovering the truth and potentially compromising the entire operation. The sonic deception operated around the clock. During daytime, the trucks played sounds of heavy construction, hammering, sawing, the noise of bridge-building equipment being assembled. It sounded like engineers were building pontoon bridges, the critical infrastructure needed for a river crossing. At night, the sonic units played sounds of vehicle movements, tanks rolling in, trucks delivering supplies, the general cacophony of a major military buildup. The sonic operations were remarkably sophisticated. The crews had specific scenarios they'd play out over multiple nights, creating a narrative of progressive preparation. The first night might feature sounds of reconnaissance vehicles and advance elements arriving. The second night, heavier equipment moving in. By the third and fourth nights, it would sound like entire tank battalions were assembling, artillery batteries positioning, engineers working furiously to prepare crossing equipment. The sounds could be heard 15 miles away. German forces on the other side of the Rhine couldn't help but hear what sounded like massive American preparations for an assault. And unlike visual observations, which could be obscured by weather or darkness, sound traveled constantly. Even on foggy nights when German observers couldn't see much, they could hear what they believed were American divisions massing for attack. The radio deception reached new levels of complexity. The signal company Special created complete traffic nets for two divisions. They didn't just transmit random messages, they created realistic, believable communication patterns that matched what you'd expect from divisions preparing for a major assault. This meant coordination messages between division staff and subordinate units, logistics requests for the materials needed for a river crossing, intelligence updates about German positions across the Rhine, artillery coordination, engineer reports, medical preparations. All of it was fake, but all of it was carefully crafted to be believable. The radio operators studied the communication patterns of the actual 30th and
79th Divisions. They learned the fists of key operators in those units. When they transmitted their fake messages, they did so in the style of those actual operators, using their characteristic rhythm and sending patterns. German signals intelligence, intercepting these transmissions, would believe they were listening to the real divisions. The radio plan for Viersen was remarkably detailed. Each fake division had its own complete network of radio stations, mimicking the structure of a real division's communications. The operators sent traffic at times that matched the circadian rhythms of real units, more activity during daytime, less at night, occasional urgent transmissions suggesting developing situations. Special effects teams added the final touches. Men from the Ghost Army, wearing the shoulder patches and insignia of the 30th and 79th Divisions, drove through nearby towns. They stopped at cafes and bars, carefully letting slip details about their unit's activities. They'd complain about the cold, discuss rumors about when the crossing would happen, speculate about casualties. All of it was scripted, all of it designed to reach German ears. Some Ghost Army soldiers would pose as MPs from the impersonated divisions, setting up checkpoints and directing traffic. Officers would establish fake command posts in buildings, with guards posted outside and proper unit markings displayed. Everything contributed to the complete fiction that two major American divisions were preparing for a Rhine crossing at Viersen. The Germans took the bait completely. Intelligence reports captured after the operation showed that German command believed the 30th and 79th Divisions were positioned exactly where the Ghost Army said they were. The Germans moved troops to defend against the expected crossing at Viersen. Artillery batteries were positioned to cover the river at that location. Defensive positions were reinforced. And then, on March 23rd, the actual crossing happened 10 miles north in the 16th Corps zone. The two real divisions attacked across the Rhine at a point the Germans hadn't reinforced because they were focused on Viersen. The crossing met disorganized resistance. Casualties were astonishingly low for such a difficult operation. The 30th Division's intelligence officer reported that the attack came as a Complete surprise to the enemy, with a consequent saving of American lives. Captured German maps showed their order of battle assessments just before the crossing. They had the 79th Division placed approximately where the Ghost Army had portrayed it. They'd completely lost track of the 30th Division. Their focus was on Viersen, exactly where the Ghost Army wanted it. The Ghost Army maintained their deception even while the real crossing was underway. They continued playing sonic recordings, transmitting radio traffic, maintaining the visual displays. German artillery, realizing too late where the actual crossing was happening, fired on the Ghost Army's positions at Viersen. Shells fell among the inflatable tanks and trucks. The crews scurried around, patching leaks, re-inflating damaged decoys, keeping the illusion alive. This was perhaps the most dangerous phase of the operation. The Germans were frustrated, angry, raining artillery on what they thought were American positions. The Ghost Army personnel, armed with nothing heavier than .50 caliber machine guns, maintained their posts, kept their equipment functioning, refused to break the deception even under fire. Remarkably, no Ghost Army personnel were killed during Viersen, though several were wounded. The inflatable equipment absorbed the punishment. Shells would rip through rubber tanks, artillery pieces would deflate, but the crews would patch them and re-inflate them, keeping the visual deception intact. Operation Viersen was the Ghost Army's final major operation. It was also, according to their own official history, their best. Everything they'd learned over the previous 10 months came together. The visual expertise from countless hours working with inflatable equipment, the sonic sophistication developed through dozens of operations, the radio finesse honed by impersonating multiple different units, the special effects techniques refined through trial and error. General Simpson, commanding the 9th Army, formally commended the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops for their work. The commendation noted that the deception had succeeded in drawing German forces away from the actual crossing point, directly contributing to the operation's success and saving American lives. For the men of the Ghost Army, Viersen represented vindication. All the training, all the previous operations, all the innovations and refinements had led to this. They'd created an illusion so complete, so convincing, that it had fooled experienced German commanders into making critical tactical errors, and in doing so, they'd saved thousands of American lives. While the major operations like Viersen represent the Ghost Army's most dramatic achievements, the day-to-day reality of serving in the unit involved long stretches of relative boredom punctuated by intense periods of dangerous activity. Understanding what life was like for these soldiers provides important context for their accomplishments. Between operations, the Ghost Army lived much like any other combat support unit. They maintained their equipment, pulled guard duty, dealt with military routine. But their equipment maintenance involved unique challenges. Inflatable tanks and trucks needed constant inspection for leaks, tears, and damage. The rubberized canvas degraded over time, especially in harsh weather. Small punctures had to be found and patched before they became larger problems. The sonic equipment required careful maintenance. The wire recorders were delicate, sophisticated pieces of equipment that didn't handle rough treatment well. The speakers and amplifiers needed to be kept dry and protected from the elements. The half-tracks that carried this equipment required the same maintenance as any military vehicle, plus additional work to ensure the specialized mounting systems remained secure. Living conditions varied widely. Sometimes the Ghost Army would be based in actual buildings, taking over French or Belgian towns as temporary headquarters. Other times they'd live in tents, foxholes, or simply sleep under trucks or in hedgerows. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was particularly brutal, with cold, rain, and snow making outdoor living miserable. Food was standard army rations, which ranged from adequate to terrible depending on supply situations and how recently the cooks had received fresh ingredients. The men supplemented their diet when possible, by trading with local civilians, exchanging cigarettes or chocolate for eggs, fresh vegetables, or wine. These interactions with civilians were always complicated by the Ghost Army's security requirements. They couldn't explain what they actually did, so they'd often claim to be from whatever real unit they'd most recently impersonated. The soldiers dealt with the same hazards as other troops. Disease was a constant concern, trench foot from constant wet conditions, respiratory infections from cold, damp weather, dysentery from contaminated food or water. The Ghost Army had medics, but serious medical issues meant evacuation to field hospitals, same as any other unit. But the Ghost Army also faced unique psychological pressures. Traditional combat units know they're fighting the enemy directly. They can see results, count enemy casualties, measure ground gained. The Ghost Army's work was more abstract. Did that last sonic operation actually fool anyone? Were the Germans taking our radio traffic seriously? Did that inflatable tank look realistic enough from the air? Success for the Ghost Army often meant nothing happened. If they successfully drew German attention to a fake position, then the real American units attacking elsewhere would have an easier time. But the Ghost Army wouldn't necessarily hear about that success. They'd pack up their equipment and move to the next operation, often not knowing if their previous deception had worked. Failure, on the other hand, was sometimes catastrophically obvious. Like at Brest, when Company D of the 709th Tank Battalion got hammered by German artillery that had been focused on Ghost Army positions. Or times when German patrols got too close to their positions and the Ghost Army had to hastily evacuate, destroying equipment if necessary to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The men dealt with constant awareness that their equipment was rigged to self-destruct. The sonic half-tracks had explosive charges built in, designed to destroy the sophisticated recording and playback equipment if capture seemed imminent. Operating these vehicles meant knowing that pulling one lever would give you 15 seconds to get clear before everything exploded. That's a unique kind of pressure. There was also the fundamental strangeness of their mission. These men were essentially actors performing for an audience that was actively trying to kill them. A successful performance meant convincing the enemy to shoot at rubber decoys instead of real soldiers. But it also meant making themselves targets, positioning themselves where the enemy would focus their attention. Despite these pressures, or perhaps because of them, the Ghost Army developed strong unit cohesion. They relied on each other in ways that went beyond typical military bonds. The artists and engineers and radio operators might have come from different backgrounds, but they shared the unique experience of fighting a war through creativity rather than firepower. They maintained their humanity through art. The sketching and painting wasn't just a pastime, it was therapy, a way to process what they were experiencing, to create something beautiful in the midst of destruction. John Jarvie's comment about sleeping in foxholes but still finding time to create watercolors speaks to how essential this creative outlet was for these men. They also maintained connections to their pre-war lives. Bill Blass sketching fashion designs, Ellsworth Kelly creating geometric patterns that would later appear in his paintings, Arthur Singer studying birds when he could find them. These activities kept them grounded, reminded them that there was a world beyond the war, a future waiting when this was all over. The men formed close friendships. Bob Tompkins and Bill Blass became lifelong friends, keeping in touch for decades after the war. Groups of Ghost Army veterans would maintain correspondence, attend each other's art exhibitions, support each other's careers. The shared experience of their unique service created bonds that lasted. As the war in Europe wound down after the Rhine crossing, the Ghost Army continued operations for a few more weeks, supporting the final Allied push into Germany. But by late April, with German resistance collapsing, the need for tactical deception diminished. The Ghost Army's work was essentially done. In July 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops returned to the United States. After the Japanese surrender on September 2nd, the unit was officially deactivated on September 15th. The men were discharged and returned to civilian life. And then came the hardest part, keeping the secret. When Ghost Army veterans came home from Europe, they faced a unique burden. They'd participated in operations that saved thousands of American lives. They'd created innovations in military deception that would influence warfare for generations. They'd served their country with creativity and courage, and they couldn't tell anyone about it. The Army's security classification on Ghost Army operations was
absolute. The men were sworn to secrecy. They couldn't discuss their missions with family, friends, or anyone else. The reasoning was straightforward. Military deception had proven remarkably effective. The techniques developed by the Ghost Army might need to be used again against different enemies in different conflicts. If potential adversaries knew exactly how American deception operations worked, they'd be prepared for them. This made sense from a military security standpoint, but it placed enormous psychological weight on the veterans. They'd come home from war changed, as all veterans do. But unlike most soldiers, they couldn't share their experiences, couldn't explain what they'd done, couldn't talk through the fear and stress and danger they'd faced. Many Ghost Army veterans simply told people they'd worked in camouflage. When asked for details, they'd deflect, change the subject, or give vague responses about creating concealment for military equipment. Some families knew there was something more to the story. The men would occasionally let details slip, or their wives or children would sense there were experiences they weren't sharing. But for decades, the full truth remained hidden. Bernie Bluestein kept the secret for over 50 years. His son Keith later recalled, "All he would say is that he did camouflage. He kept that secret for over 50 years. Bernie would mention creating fake things, signs, labels, license plates, but never explained the full scope of the operations, never described the danger, never revealed the sophisticated deceptions they'd executed. This silence was particularly difficult for the artists. They'd created remarkable work, developed innovative techniques, contributed to victory through their creativity. But they couldn't exhibit that work, couldn't discuss their techniques, couldn't take credit for their contributions. The sketches and paintings they'd made during the war remained private, often stored away, rarely if ever shown. Some Ghost Army veterans simply avoided thinking about their service. They'd built successful civilian careers, created new lives, and focusing on the past didn't serve any purpose. Bill Blass became one of America's premier fashion designers, but he rarely discussed his military service publicly. Ellsworth Kelly's war experiences clearly influenced his art, but he didn't talk much about the Ghost Army's operations. A few articles appeared in the immediate aftermath of the war, before security classifications were fully implemented. A December 6, 1945 article in the Meriden Daily Journal described some of the Ghost Army's techniques, mentioning inflatable tanks and sonic deception. But these early articles were quickly forgotten, and the subsequent security classification meant no follow-up stories could be written. In 1985, a Smithsonian Magazine article brought renewed attention to the Ghost Army, but the operations remained officially classified. The article generated interest, letting people know that this unusual unit had existed, but it couldn't provide full details about specific operations or techniques. The ghost soldiers themselves still couldn't talk freely about their experiences. The breakthrough came in 1996 when the operations were finally declassified. After more than 50 years, the men of the Ghost Army could finally tell their stories. Families learned for the first time what their fathers or grandfathers had actually done during the war. The full scope of the deceptions became public knowledge, but declassification came too late for many. Hundreds of Ghost Army veterans had already passed away, taking their stories to their graves, never receiving public recognition for their service. They'd kept the secret as ordered, maintaining operational security even though the Cold War enemy they might have been protecting against had also ceased to exist. Those who were still alive in 1996 had mixed reactions to the declassification. Some were relieved to finally share their experiences. Others had locked those memories away for so long that bringing them back was difficult. Many simply wished their fallen comrades, the men who'd served beside them and died without recognition, could have lived to see their story finally told. Rick Beyer, a filmmaker and historian, became fascinated with the Ghost Army's story after declassification. He began researching the unit, interviewing survivors, collecting documents and photographs. His work would eventually lead to a 2013 PBS documentary titled The Ghost Army, and a 2015 book, The Ghost Army of World War II, co-authored with Elizabeth Sales, whose father William Sales had served in the unit. Beyer's documentary brought the Ghost Army story to a wide audience for the first time. Veterans who'd never been able to explain their service to their families could now sit down with them and watch a documentary that showed exactly what they'd done. Grandchildren learned that their grandfather hadn't just worked in camouflage, but had helped execute some of the most sophisticated military deceptions in history. The documentary and book sparked renewed interest in giving the Ghost Army official recognition. Families of veterans, supported by Beyer and the Ghost Army Legacy Project he'd helped establish, began advocating for congressional gold medals to honor the unit's service. This would prove to be a long campaign, requiring nearly a decade of effort. The effort to obtain congressional gold medals for the Ghost Army veterans began in earnest in the early 2010s. The Congressional Gold Medal is the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow, awarded to individuals or groups who have performed outstanding service to the United States. Previous recipients include George Washington, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Navajo Code Talkers, and other distinguished individuals and units. Getting congressional approval for any medal requires sponsorship by members of Congress, bipartisan support, and often years of persistent advocacy. For the Ghost Army, this process was complicated by the fact that most veterans were now in their 90s or had already passed away. Time was running short. Rick Beyer, as president of the Ghost Army Legacy Project, became one of the primary advocates. Family members of Ghost Army veterans joined the effort. They contacted their representatives, organized letter-writing campaigns, shared their stories with anyone who would listen. The goal was to get Congress to recognize these veterans while at least some of them were still alive. Representative Anne McLean Kuster of New Hampshire was recruited to sponsor legislation. Beyer had gone to college with Kuster, giving him a personal connection. When approached about the Ghost Army, Kuster thought it would be straightforward. How hard could that be? She recalled wondering. It turns out it took 7 years. The legislative process moved slowly. Bills were introduced, discussed, amended, reintroduced. The effort required building bipartisan support, educating congressional staff about the Ghost Army's contributions, overcoming bureaucratic obstacles. Representative Chris Stewart of Utah joined the effort after the granddaughter of Ghost Army veteran Stanley Nance did a school project on the unit and brought it to his attention. Senator Edward Markey of Massachusetts became a key Senate sponsor. The effort gained momentum as more members of Congress learned the story and recognized the significance of what the Ghost Army had accomplished. Both Democrats and Republicans supported the recognition, united in honoring these veterans. On February 1st, 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act into law. The legislation specifically honored the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and the 3133rd Signal Service Company, recognizing their unique and highly distinguished service in conducting deception operations in Europe during World War II. But passing the law and actually holding the medal ceremony took additional time. The COVID-19 pandemic caused delays. The US Mint needed to design and produce the actual medals. planning the ceremony required coordination between congressional leadership, military officials, and the Ghost Army Legacy Project. Finally, on March 21, 2024, the ceremony was held at the United States Capitol. By this time, only 7 Ghost Army veterans were still alive. 3 of them attended: Bernard Bluestein, age 100, John Christman, age 99, and Seymour Nussenbaum, also age 100. The ceremony was held in Emancipation Hall at the Capitol Visitor Center. The room was filled with family members of Ghost Army veterans, congressional leaders from both parties, military officials, and supporters who'd worked for years to make this recognition happen. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson opened the ceremony by reading from the
now declassified Army report on the Ghost Army. Rarely, if ever, has there existed a group of such few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. It was a powerful acknowledgement from the official Army assessment of just how significant the Ghost Army's contributions had been. Secretary of the Army Christine Wormuth spoke about the Ghost Army's continuing relevance. She noted that modern military planners still teach that the basis of military deception is storytelling, and the Ghost Army had been master storytellers. Even though technology has changed quite a bit since 1944, Wormuth said, our modern techniques build on a lot of what the Ghost Army did, and we are still learning from your legacy. This was an important point. The Ghost Army wasn't just a historical curiosity. Their techniques, their approaches to deception, their integration of multiple deception methods, all of this continues to influence military thinking today. US observations of the war in Ukraine, Wormuth noted, had shown that even with increasingly transparent battlefields, military deception can still have significant impact on operations. Senator Markey spoke about the creativity of the Ghost Army veterans. They were creative, original thinkers who used engineering, art, architecture, and advertising to wage battle with the enemy. Their weapons were unconventional, but their patriotism was unquestionable. Rick Beyer addressed the gathering, speaking for the veterans who could no longer speak for themselves. No soldier who served in this unit considers himself a hero. I have talked to many veterans of the Ghost Army, and each told me that the real heroes were the infantrymen and the tankers who bore the brunt of the fighting. Then he added with emotion, they would have been shocked that 80 years later, a grateful nation would honor them in this way. Of the 3 veterans present, only Bernie Bluestein spoke. At 100 years old, confined to a wheelchair, he offered simple thanks to everyone who'd supported the effort to recognize the Ghost Army. You've all contributed to my existence and to my being who I am, he said. The Congressional Gold Medal itself was designed by the US Mint specifically for the Ghost Army. The front depicts Ghost Army soldiers conducting their various duties, transmitting radio signals, checking equipment, sewing patches, and insignia. The reverse side displays the logos of the 23rd Headquarters, Special Troops, and 3133rd Signal Service Company, along with locations where the unit served: France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, and Italy. For the veterans who attended, the ceremony represented closure. Bernie Bluestein later reflected, the anticipation was killing me. This represents my service. I took it for granted and didn't realize the impact until now. I'm very happy to say I was involved in that. I'm delighted and pleased by this honor. But the medal also honored the hundreds of Ghost Army veterans who hadn't lived to see this recognition. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed in action during the war. They died defending an illusion, protecting a deception, maintaining a fiction that saved real lives. Dozens more were wounded. All of them kept the secret for as long as they were ordered to, many taking that secret to their graves. The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond the Congressional Gold Medal. In 2016,
The Ghost Army Legacy Project was formally established as a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving and sharing the unit's story. The project has erected historical markers at Ghost Army operation sites in Europe, including one in Bettembourg, Luxembourg, and another in Plabennec, France, commemorating Operation Brest. On November 3rd, 2022, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were made honorary members of the U.S. Army Psychological Operations Regiment, recognizing that the modern PSYOPs community traces part of its heritage to the Ghost Army's innovations. Museums have featured Ghost Army exhibits. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans created a traveling exhibition, Ghost Army, the Combat Con Artists of World War II, which has visited museums across the country. These exhibits feature actual Ghost Army artifacts, including inflatable equipment, artwork created by the soldiers, uniforms, and documents. They bring the story to new generations, ensuring that the Ghost Army's contributions aren't forgotten. The story has captured public imagination in a way few World War II narratives have. Perhaps it's the unusual nature of the unit, the creative approach to warfare, the idea of artists and designers becoming soldiers. Or maybe it's the fundamental human appeal of the underdog, of a small unit achieving outsized impact through cleverness rather than firepower. Whatever the reason, the Ghost Army's story continues to fascinate. Education programs have incorporated the Ghost Army into World War II curriculum. Students learn about tactical deception, about the importance of creativity in problem solving, about how unconventional thinking can change outcomes. The Ghost Army becomes a case study in innovation, adaptability, and the power of interdisciplinary approaches. The unit's influence on modern military doctrine is real and ongoing. While specific current deception techniques remain classified, military planners acknowledge that the Ghost Army's integration of visual, audio, and electronic deception established patterns that modern operations still follow. The principle of creating complete multimedia illusions that address multiple intelligence gathering methods remains fundamental to military deception. In an era when warfare increasingly involves information operations, cyberspace, and sophisticated sensors, the Ghost Army's basic insight remains valid. Successful deception requires understanding your adversary's intelligence gathering
capabilities and crafting illusions that address all of those capabilities simultaneously. You can't just fool the eye, or just fool the ear, or just create false electronic signals. You need to create a complete, coherent picture that withstands scrutiny from multiple angles. The Ghost Army demonstrated something else important, that creativity and unconventional thinking can be just as valuable in warfare as traditional military skills. The men who served in the 23rd came from backgrounds that weren't typically associated with military service. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, creative professionals. But their unconventional skills, properly applied, saved thousands of lives and contributed significantly to Allied victory. As you've listened to this story, you've heard about inflatable tanks and sonic trucks, about radio operators who became voice actors, about artists who painted camouflage instead of canvases. You've learned about the operations at Brest and Metz, about holding gaps in defensive lines with nothing but rubber decoys and sound effects, about Operation Viersen and the successful deception that helped the 9th Army cross the Rhine. But at its core, the Ghost Army's story is about something more fundamental: the power of human creativity, even in the midst of humanity's darkest moments. War typically brings out innovation in weapons, in tactics, in the application of force. The Ghost Army represented a different kind of innovation. They weaponized imagination. They turned artistic skill into a tool of war. They proved that sometimes the most effective military operation
isn't the one with the most firepower, but the one with the best story. Think about what they accomplished with relatively little. 1,100 men equipped with rubber tanks, phonograph records, and radio transmitters convinced German command that they faced forces 30 times their actual size. They saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives, not by killing enemy soldiers, but by deceiving them, by directing their attention to illusions while real American forces maneuvered elsewhere. The Ghost Army proved that war isn't just about physical combat, it's about information, perception, and psychology. The Germans had experienced intelligence officers, sophisticated signals, interception capabilities, aerial reconnaissance. They weren't easily fooled, but the Ghost Army understood that effective deception isn't about creating obvious fakes. It's about creating believable illusions that fit within the enemy's expectations, that tell a story the enemy already wants to believe. That's why the attention to detail mattered so much. The imperfect camouflage, the realistic tank tracks, the scattered ammunition around fake artillery positions, the laundry hanging near fake bivouacs. Each detail contributed to a complete picture. Each element reinforced the others. The visual, sonic, and radio elements worked
together, creating a multimedia story that German intelligence could verify through multiple channels. Of course, those were real American divisions. We can see their tanks, hear their activities, intercept their radio traffic. Everything confirms what we're seeing. The men who created these illusions came from civilian backgrounds that valued creativity, design, and aesthetic judgment. They brought those values into military service, applying artistic sensibilities to tactical problems. Bill Blass's eye for design helped create more realistic visual deceptions. Ellsworth Kelly's understanding of form and space improved camouflage effectiveness. The sound engineer's technical expertise enabled sonic deceptions that could fool experienced soldiers. The radio operator's improvisational skills created believable traffic patterns. These weren't conventional military skills, but they proved absolutely essential. The Ghost Army also demonstrated the value of interdisciplinary teams. The visual deception specialists couldn't succeed alone. They needed sonic units to provide supporting audio. They needed radio operators to create electronic confirmation. They needed combat engineers to provide security and physical construction. Each component brought different expertise, different perspectives, different skills. The synergy of these different approaches created something more effective than any single component could achieve alone. In today's world, where information warfare and deception operations take place across digital networks, where social media and instant communication change how information spreads, the Ghost Army's lessons remain relevant. They teach us about the construction of believable narratives, about the importance of consistency across different information channels, about understanding your adversary's intelligence-gathering capabilities and crafting deceptions that address those capabilities. They also remind us that innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The US Army in 1943 wasn't naturally inclined to recruit artists and designers for combat-adjacent roles, but someone had the wisdom to recognize that the skills needed for effective tactical deception weren't traditional military skills. They required creative thinking, artistic sensibility, technical innovation. The success of the Ghost Army vindicated that unconventional approach. For the men who served in the 23rd, their Ghost Army experience shaped the rest of their lives in various ways. Some, like Bill Blass and Ellsworth Kelly, went on to famous careers where their wartime experiences clearly influenced their work. Others returned to quieter lives, carrying memories they couldn't share for decades. All of them contributed to victory through means most soldiers never employ. The 50 years of secrecy added another dimension to their service. They couldn't seek recognition, couldn't share their stories, couldn't even explain to their families what they'd actually done. They simply returned to civilian life and moved forward, knowing they'd done something important but unable to discuss it. That kind of silent service requires its own form of courage. The Congressional Gold Medal, awarded in 2024, finally gave these veterans the public recognition they deserved, but for many, it came too late. Hundreds of Ghost Army veterans passed away without ever receiving acknowledgement for their contributions. They kept the secret as ordered, maintained operational security even after the tactical need for secrecy had long since passed, and died without recognition. That sacrifice, that silent service across decades, deserves to be remembered alongside their wartime achievements. These men saved American lives through creativity and deception during the war, then served their country again by keeping those methods classified for decades, ensuring those techniques could potentially be used again if needed. The Ghost Army's story is ultimately about seeing warfare differently. Instead of viewing every problem as something to be solved through firepower, they approached tactical challenges as creative problems requiring innovative solutions. They understood that sometimes the most effective weapon is a good story, well told, consistently maintained across multiple information channels. In an era when we often assume that bigger, more technologically advanced weapons are always better, the Ghost Army reminds us that human creativity, cleverness, and careful attention to detail can be just as powerful. Sometimes the best military operation is the one where nobody fires a shot, where the enemy is defeated through deception rather than destruction, where lives are saved through illusion rather than lost through combat. If you've enjoyed learning about the Ghost Army and their remarkable story of creativity under fire, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to Whispering Wars. We explore the hidden histories, the unusual stories, the fascinating corners of World War I, World War II, and Vietnam that you might not have heard before. The Ghost Army represents exactly the kind of story we love to tell. Important, impactful, but often overlooked in conventional military histories. Share this video with anyone who appreciates stories of innovation, creativity, and unconventional thinking. The Ghost Army's legacy deserves to be widely known, their contributions recognized, their creative approach to warfare remembered and studied. From the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine, from inflatable tanks to sonic deception, from radio trickery to special effects, the Ghost Army waged war through imagination. They proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is a good story, carefully crafted and convincingly told. And in doing so, they saved thousands of American lives while pioneering approaches to military deception that continue to influence warfare today. Their story is a washi reminder that in war, as in life, creativity matters. Innovation matters, the willingness to approach problems differently, to value unconventional skills, to trust in the power of human ingenuity. These things can change outcomes in profound ways. The Ghost Army fought with paintbrushes and pneumatic compressors, with phonograph records and radio transmitters, with imagination and creativity. They won battles without firing a shot. They saved lives through deception rather than destroying them through combat. And they proved that sometimes the most powerful force on the battlefield isn't violence, it's a really good illusion.